Okay, so for all of you out there working hard and getting ready for the UPSC exams, staying on top of everything going on in the world is so important. And today we're going to really dig into something big, something with huge implications for how you understand governance, human rights, and international law, all super key areas for both mains and prelims.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing we're zeroing in on is the alarming jump in executions globally that we saw in 2024.
Yeah.
It's a serious situation that hit its highest point since way back in 2015, and getting why this is happening. It's not just about memorizing a statistic. It's about understanding the really complex ways national and international rules play out.
Exactly. And our analysis today is coming straight from Amnesty International's new yearly report. It's called Death Sentences and Executions 2024. And Down to Earth reported on it on March 31st, 2025. So what we want to do in this deep dive is break down the main things causing this scary rise, pinpoint the countries that are most affected, really look at the reasons they're giving, and put it all within the framework of international human rights. This isn't just numbers, folks. This reflects changes happening in societies and politics around the world. So let's start by looking at the numbers themselves head on.
Yeah, the report gives us a grim total of 1,518 executions in 15 countries. Just last year, 2024, and like you said, it's the highest we've seen in almost a decade. It really underlines a major and worrisome shift away from getting rid of the death penalty.
And it's really striking how concentrated these executions are geographically. The Middle East, with Saudi Arabia and Iraq leading the way, made up a massive 91% of all the known executions across the globe. It's a stark picture of where this is happening the most.
And the numbers from those three countries really show how big this is. Iran's reported executions were at least 972 in 2024. That's a crazy increase of 119% from the year before. Saudi Arabia doubled their numbers, hitting at least 335. And maybe the most disturbing is Iraq. Their executions almost quadrupled, jumping from 16 in 2023 to 63 in 2024.
When you see those numbers, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq responsible for 300 and 380 executions globally, it really brings home how big this is, but the report doesn't stop at just showing us the figures. It brings up some very serious questions about why this increase is happening.
Yeah, one thing that really stands out is the main point the report makes, that the death penalty is more and more being used as a weapon by certain countries. The argument is that it's not just a response to really awful crimes anymore, but a way to shut down disagreement, target minorities, and enforce strict drug laws. Amnesty International is super clear that using it like this breaks the core principles of international law. This ties directly into UPSC topics about a country's power and the limits set by international human rights rules.
For sure. Agnes Callamard, Amnesty International's Secretary General, she came out with a strong statement condemning the death penalty. She called it an abhorrent crime with no place in today's world. And she specifically named Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia for their part in this scary increase, highlighting how they're callously taking people's lives for drug-related and terrorism charges. This raises a crucial question for us as we analyze this. How exactly are these countries using the death penalty in this way? So let's dig into some specific examples they highlight.
Okay, so let's look at Iran. The report shines a light on how they use the death penalty after the Woman Life Freedom protests. Now, this is crucial for UPSC students who are studying social movements and how governments react. The report documents at least 2 executions in 2024 directly tied to these protests, and one that's especially troubling is the reported execution of a young person with a mental disability in one of these cases. And on top of that, Amnesty International says there were unfair trials and maybe even confessions gotten through torture in both cases. If we look at this through the lens of international standards of due process and the rule of law, it paints a pretty troubling picture of how the state responded to the protests.
And the situation in Saudi Arabia also shows us a clear example of how they're allegedly silencing dissent. The report points to the execution of people from the Shia minority group who were part of anti-government protests over a decade ago. The case of Abdulmajid al-Nimr really stands out. He was initially accused of things related to the protests, but ended up being tried and executed for terrorism charges linked to al-Qaeda. Amnesty International sees this change in charges as a sign that he was prosecuted for political reasons, using terrorism as an excuse to silence opposition. That's been around for a long time. This brings up important questions about how anti-terrorism laws are used and how they could be misused to stop legitimate protests, which is a relevant area for understanding governance and human rights.
These examples highlight something crucial for you all thinking about the UPSC exams. The death penalty could be used as a tool by the government to scare people and stop opposition, instead of as a last resort for the absolute worst crimes like international law says it should be.
So where do these countries fit in the global picture? The report says China has the highest number of executions, although we don't have exact figures after China. In the top 5 are Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Yemen. It's that heavy concentration in the Middle East that really needs our attention. Now, let's shift gears and look at trends in other regions, specifically the United States.
One interesting thing to see is the steady upward trend in executions in the U.S. Since the pandemic started in 2024, there were 25 executions, a bit higher than the 24 in 2023. Now, these numbers are way lower than what we see in the Middle East. But the fact that they're consistently going up is something to notice for those of you studying criminal justice systems and how society views capital punishment.
And Amnesty directly addresses the arguments you often hear in the U.S., especially from former President Trump, about the death penalty being a deterrent to violent crime. The report specifically says that's not true. That kind of talk promotes a false idea and dehumanizes people. Amnesty's position, which they've held for a long time, is that there's no real proof that the death penalty is uniquely effective at stopping crime. This is a key point to think about when you're analyzing different views on criminal justice and peaponology. So what does all this mean when we look at the types of crimes that lead to these executions globally?
This brings us to a particularly troubling trend that the report highlights: the growing number of executions for drug-related offenses in 2024. Over 40% of all recorded executions were for these types of crimes. This is a critical point for UPSC because international human rights law is very clear that the death penalty should only be used for the most serious crimes, and based on current international legal standards set out in various human rights agreements, drug offenses don't qualify.
That difference is super important to understand. So which countries are still giving and carrying out death sentences for drug crimes?
The report names Iran, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and China as places where this is still happening. What's especially worrying is that the report says this affects people from poor backgrounds more than others, which raises serious questions about fairness and access to justice in those legal systems. The report also mentions some uncertainty about whether Vietnam is using the death penalty for drug offenses.
And what's alarming is the report also points to countries that are thinking about bringing back capital punishment for drug offenses. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. The Maldives, Nigeria, and Tonga are specifically mentioned as countries where there have been talks about bringing back the death penalty for drug crimes. If that happens, it would be a huge step backward from international human rights standards and something to keep an eye on for those of you following global legal and political developments.
This all sounds pretty concerning, but the report does highlight some progress in the global movement against the death penalty, doesn't it?
It definitely does. Even though the execution numbers are going up in a worrying way, it's important to see that the number of countries actually carrying out executions was at an all-time low for the second year in a row, only 15 countries. And the long-term trend toward ending the death penalty is still getting stronger right now. 113 countries are fully abolitionist, meaning they've gotten rid of the death penalty for all crimes, and 145 countries have abolished it, either in law or in practice. These numbers show a clear global movement away from capital punishment.
That's a majority of the world's nations moving away from this. And there were some concrete positive steps in 2024 too, weren't there?
Yes, Zimbabwe took a big step by getting rid of the death penalty for regular crimes in 2024.
Yeah.
Which is worth noting for those of you studying legal reforms and human rights progress in Africa. And the UN General Assembly passed its 10th resolution calling for a worldwide pause on the death penalty. What's important is that more than 2/3 of the member states supported this resolution, which shows a growing international agreement against capital punishment and strengthens the arguments against it in international forums.
And there were even good outcomes for people who are already facing the death penalty.
Right. The report highlights how legal changes in Malaysia got over 1,000 people off death row, giving them another chance at life. This shows how policy changes can really make a difference in people's lives and how legal reforms can match up with evolving human rights standards.
So to sum up our discussion today, the main takeaway for you all as UPSC aspirants is this huge and really worrying increase in global executions in 2024. This rise is mostly because of a small number of countries in the Middle East where how they're using capital punishment raises serious human rights concerns, especially when it comes to silencing dissent and punishing drug offenses practices that often go against international legal norms. Understanding these details is super important for your mains answers on governance, human rights, and international relations.
Exactly. And don't forget, this analysis is based on Amnesty International's latest report, as reported by Down to Earth. We really encourage you to check out this report and think about it critically as part of your prep. It'll give you valuable data and perspectives for both prelims and mains.
Absolutely. Getting these global trends is key to your preparation for different parts of the UPSC syllabus, including human rights governance, international relations, and social justice. We urge you to really examine the ethical and legal sides of what we talked about today as you continue studying. Okay, now for one last thought to ponder. Given that there's a clear global trend toward getting rid of the death penalty, and the UN has repeatedly called for a pause on it, what are the biggest roadblocks and the best chances for improving human rights and justice around the world? What can international organizations and individual countries do to tackle these complex challenges? This question touches on many important themes that are relevant to your journey with the UPSC.
It's a vital question to keep thinking about and analyzing.
And for you, our listener, as you're working hard to prepare for your UPSC exams and staying engaged with these crucial global issues, we encourage you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with any more questions or insights you have on this important topic. Your engagement helps us make future deep dives that fit your specific needs and interests as UPSC aspirants, so we can cover the stuff that will help you succeed the most. Thanks for joining us for this important conversation, and we wish you all the best in your preparation.
Best of luck.